We're back with Dan Morgenstern. We're talking about Chicago and the people in it. Just from my curiosity, what year are we talking about? When did you actually start?
I started with Downbeat as New York editor in '64, and then Don brought me to Chicago in '67. And I was in Chicago for about a little under 4 years. And of course, like most New Yorkers, I didn't want to leave, and later on, when I became editor, I suggested to the old man, the publisher, that the editor should really be in New York because that was the center of jazz activity and so on. But he wouldn't go for it. But I come to that later on. I don't want to talk too much about myself right now. But one of the things when I got to Chicago, one of the happy things was that I reconnected with Art Hodes, who was one of the first jazz musicians to be nice to me in the early days. I mean, it wasn't that anybody was not nice, but they just didn't bother very much with me. Art, whom I met at Jimmy Ryan's, at the first Jimmy Ryan's on 52nd Street, was genuinely, once he found out that I had arrived from Europe not too long ago, and he was genuinely interested, and we got to be friendly. And then he left and went back to Chicago, and so I renewed my friendship with him. And in Chicago, he was a pretty important presence. He was the main factor in the traditional jazz. There was a lot going on in traditional jazz in Chicago, but he was the one with a national and international reputation and so on. And he wrote a column for Downbeat, and he was also on television. He had a long-running show that I forget what the name of it was. And it took place in a fictitious jazz club.
It's called Jazz Alley.
Jazz Alley, thank you, that was the name of it. So this was, and Art was very good at that. He was a good writer. He had his own magazine in New York, and he was a sharp guy, but he was very, personally he was very relaxed and not at all in any way high pressured. I must say one thing, the first time I saw Art when I came to Chicago, he was working in a small club, and I almost fell on the floor because in addition to piano, there was an electric piano, and there was Art playing Watermelon Man, which was very popular at the time, on an electric piano. That was a big surprise. But that's because he kept up with things, and of course Watermelon Man is just a blues thing, and he was really steeped in the blues. So that was a nice. He brought in people from other places. He brought in Albert Nicholas, whom I had never seen actually, and it was, he was a major presence on the Chicago jazz scene. One time for the TV, he brought in Eddie Condon and Pee Wee and Jimmy McPartland, and it was kind of a reunion of the Chicagoans. And I was at the rehearsal they did there, and Jimmy, who in many ways was a wonderful guy, but he was a little, he was, as a bandstand presence, he could be a bit, a bit too mobile and not paying much attention to the people next to him. So when they were rehearsing, Jimmy's elbow kept getting in Pee Wee's way. So Pee Wee in his old 20s he said, "I'll give you $5 if you change places with me." But that turned out to be a good show, I mean, needless to say. Pee-wee is another, we have to devote a whole thing to Pee-wee. We can't just talk about him in passing.
Okay. On that show, I remember seeing musicians I had never heard of before or since, I suppose. There was a very good drummer named Bob Cousins. And the fellow I want to ask you about, this is out of left field, so you can tell me not to, but is a trumpet player named Norm Murphy.
Oh, yes. Norm had been in Gene Krupa's band at the same time as Roy Eldridge, and he was a great friend and admirer of Roy, and was really one of the people. Roy would have come to Chicago. Chicago was where he first made a name for himself, you know, in the 30s. Murphy brought him in a few times, you know, and sometimes they played together. And Norm was a great Roy Eldridge expert. He knew all of Roy's records and everything, and he was a very good trumpet player. We had him on the show, Bob Kaiser and I, as a member of Marty Grosz's big band. And Marty is another one who is not originally from Chicago at all, but who was a presence there, and that's where I got to know Marty, who is unique, you know. And actually, our respective fathers knew each other a little bit. Marty's father was the great George Grosz, who was a painter, and his also during the Weimar Republic, and not only with the rise of the Nazis, he was a great character. He made political cartoons that were savagely, you know, knowledgeable about that part of the German psyche, and it's just great. When he came to America, it was hard for him to adjust, because he said, I can't do what I did in Germany about America because I just don't know enough, and it had to be something, you know, almost instinctive. So here he began to paint more conventionally. He's still very highly regarded, and Marty and I are almost the same age, and we were both, he was born in Germany, I was born, we were both, you know, German speakers originally. Marty is such a, you know, aside from being a wonderful guitarist and a very good band leader when he, you know, whenever he has the chance, and a great singer, he has a wonderful sense of humor. And, remember his version of Yes, We Have No Bananas?
No. I remember Marty's version of Mississippi Mud in German, and Just a Gigolo that went on for days.
Yeah.
But not Yes, We Have No Bananas.
Yes, We Have No Bananas is about, with an accent, about a fruit peddler in the street. Then he goes through a whole list of what they have, you know, which includes lychee nuts and all kinds of things, but no bananas. So, anyway, Marty was a really great discovery. I mean, I had known about him before, but I got to know him in Chicago. There was a terrific drummer named Wayne Jones, and Wayne was not only a great drummer, but he also had exceptional knowledge and understanding of jazz. I used him, downbeat, I used him to review mainly the traditional stuff, but he was good all around the whole thing. He was really, he was a very, very dear man, and very knowledgeable about the music. See, musicians who really know that much and really are interested in the history, and they're not that common, you know. I mean, they know a lot about what they did themselves and what they had contact with, but to be really interested in the whole picture is not that common. So Wayne was somebody I really came to appreciate. And then there was, of course, the AACM, Association for the Advancement of Creative Musicians, and that was a South Side phenomenon, and it was what we came to call the avant-garde, but it was really, it was an association which is rare, again, about musicians to successfully get together in a communal effort. There were attempts in New York, and they all foundered because there was too much personality conflict involved there. And not, you know, people not being quite sure of each other's motives. In Chicago, it was quite different, and one person really responsible for that is Muhal Richard Abrams, who now has lived in New York for many, many years. He was recognized as an NEA jazz master, which I was extremely happy about. And he was really the one who brought it all together. And as in anything involving artists, you know, it's not always easy to have different temperaments and so, but he did a great job with that. He's also an exceptional musician. He is a pianist and composer, and I'll mention two things about him that were really interesting. One was I already had come to know Muhal, who was interested in hearing more James P. Johnson and other stride pianists. So he came to I invited him to come to my apartment, and I didn't have my whole record collection, but almost all of it, and we listened to stuff. But then I went to the Plug Nickel, which was the big Chicago jazz club, along with the London House, and to see Woody Herman's band. And I walk in, and who's sitting at the piano? Muhal. And he did a great job. So I asked Woody, who I knew, and then I asked him about that, and he said, he's my first call pianist when I'm in Chicago and something happens to my guy. So something happened to his regular piano player, I forget who it was at the moment, got sick or something, and he called Muhal in a minute. So there, again, the kind of misconception also among critics that musicians are limited to one particular style that they get associated with. A real jazz musician can do almost anything within the framework of the music, but Muhal is an exception. Then I had the pleasure of serving with him as a judge at the Collegiate Jazz Festival at Notre Dame, which was an annual event. I, for some reason, Father Wiskirchen, who was a priest who ran the jazz band at Notre Dame, and whose prized pupil, he also had ran the jazz program at the high school in Niles, Illinois, small town, and his prized pupil was Jim McNeely, whom I first saw when he was about 11. So anyway, Father Wiskirchen ran this jazz festival, except that it was student run, and that's what made it the best of the many collegiate jazz festivals that I had to attend when I became involved with Downbeat. But this one was special, and they also had a very good group of judges where I was the only non-musician involved. And Muhal, there were different attitudes among the musicians who, when they were judging. Some were very good, some were very, you know, like overly critical, not really aware of, you know, how these things worked. But Muhal was terrific, and he had an extreme sense of fairness, and he wasn't at all you know, affected by the kind of music that he was known for. He was very open. So he's somebody I greatly respect, and one of the people that I really was happy to get to know in Chicago. We also worked together on the Chicago Jazz Institute, of which Don DeMichael was one of the founders, along with a wonderful lady named Harriet Choice, who at one time was the jazz critic for the Chicago Tribune. Later she became the travel editor of the Trib, and who was instrumental in getting the Institute started. And that was a combination of people that was very good because it represented the whole spectrum of Chicago jazz. And it's still in existence, of course. They're involved in the Chicago Jazz Festival, which is a free event and held outdoors. It's very nice. Harriet and Muhal and Don DeMichael, and a very nice clergyman whose name I have forgotten, unfortunately, sign of old age, who was also active in the Chicago community, but was an amateur jazz musician, and he did a lot of good for musicians who were in trouble, got themselves in trouble. And so it was kind of a rainbow, and the Institute did some good, and Harriet was an excellent jazz critic, but she is really, like me, I never liked the term critic, you know. I think she was just somebody who really loved jazz, and she never considered herself, you know, somebody who sat in judgment of musicians. And again, she was very open to different things. And she's still very active within the Institute. And then there was a great guy in Chicago who was a jazz advocate and a historian and a tremendous collector. He also had his own jazz label for a while. It was called Steiner Davis, and that was John Steiner, who was an amazing person. And he lived in Chicago, and he owned a big building which had been a bathhouse. You know, in the days they used to have bathhouses. I don't think they exist anymore, but I remember them from Copenhagen, you know, from my childhood. He converted this bathhouse into an apartment, and in the basement he had his recording studio, and that's where he had all his records and stuff. And he would have these get-togethers maybe once a week, maybe not quite as frequent as that, where he knew all the people who were still alive in Chicago who had a historic role to play. So that's where I met Edith Wilson, who even as in her old age was a charming, absolutely charming lady, and a very good singer in her day. And she had been one of the many Aunt Jemimas, but she was anything but that. You know, she was active in Europe in the 20s and early 30s, and she told us that she was in Romania and even learned to sing a song in Romanian. And there were other people, I don't remember all of them, but John knew everything. John was very helpful to me when I came to Chicago in terms of downbeat, and he also told me that downbeat at one point in time was throwing out what really was its archives, photographs and clippings and everything. And fortunately, he said he didn't get there quite early enough, but he got there before they had disposed of everything. They just threw it out. You know, it's insane. But he salvaged a lot of it. And then he had his own lifelong collection of all these things, which he donated to the collection at the University of Chicago, but to this day, they really haven't done enough with it. There was a really nice lady, Debbie Gillespie, wasn't related to Dizzy, who did a very good job there, but then there were other people. Anyway, it's a marvelous collection, and it should be better known, and it should be more open to use. You know, I think there's still, after all these years, I don't think it's still fully accessible and cataloged and so on. But John was a remarkable guy. And when I first came to Chicago, he asked me if I wanted to see some of the places that were historically, you know. So we went for a drive. He pointed out, and we stopped in some places, Lincoln Gardens, and all those places. He knew everything. He pointed to a place and he said, "That's on the first floor. That's where Freddie Kepler died," you know, and stuff like that. He was an amazing guy, and his recordings were very interesting. What he did. He was the only one who recorded this great pianist who had mental trouble and was put in an asylum.
Cassino Simpson.
Yes, Cassino Simpson was
Okay.
the only one that did.
Those recordings are extraordinary.
Yeah. So, I mean, there were remarkable people in Chicago. It was, and you know, because it was more concentrated than in New York, you know, there was a real change. Rush Street at the time that I was there was still very active. Then there were the Brecker brothers, you know, they were both Chicago guys, who, if I may say so, I mean, they came from a good upper middle class Jewish family, and their parents were not at all happy about the fact that they became jazz musicians. I think later on when they became well known,